So this video is going to be covering the second half of chapter 9, 9.5 and 9.8. And we're going to start with section 9.5. Here we're looking at the whole muscle. So not the microscopic and not the physiology, but after all of those pieces, how does the actual muscle do what it needs to do to move the skeleton? So we're going to start with some principles that will be muscle mechanics of how the actual muscle works. So the first part of this whole muscle contraction, muscle mechanics piece is going to be talking about that the whole principle of this muscle is to be able to contract the single fiber and then the whole muscle. So we're going to talk a lot about how one thing doesn't do a whole lot of work, but when you have a bunch of those put together, like in a muscle, a lot of work can happen. So contraction will actually produce something called muscle tension. And this is the biggest force that we're going to talk about within this chapter. It's the purpose behind a muscle contraction. So muscle tension is a big concept. And this is going to be the force that is exerted by a contracting muscle. But not just is the force being exerted by the contracting muscle, but it will be on some sort of other object. So it'll be doing something to something in order for that to be moved or in order for work to begin. So there's going to be opposing forces. So when you have something pushing this way, there's going to be something pushing back. And so we're going to create this tension. The whole purpose is to be able to move something, usually called the load. But what we're going to talk about is moving your bones. So when you're looking at this whole muscle contraction, the biggest thing that we're talking about is going to be not always going to be the same outcome. So the big premises here is going to be force and duration of the contraction is going to be very specific based on the stimuli and the frequency and the intensity of the stimuli. So every muscle is served by at least one motor nerve. So what we're going to talk about is this concept called a motor unit. So motor nerve, axon, neuromuscular junction, we're going to revisit all of these concepts again. So when we're talking about a motor unit, this is an important concept. It's going to be one of the motor neurons. So that's going to be the connection of part A, step A of part 1 in a muscular contraction, where we're going to have the connection between the neuron and the actual muscle fiber at that neuromuscular junction. So we've got our neuron coming down, little synapse, a bunch of places. Here's our skeletal muscle fiber. We're talking about this connection point. So there'll be one motor neuron, which is this, and it will be all the muscle fibers that it will connect with. And that term is called innervate. So all of the muscle fibers, so it could connect to multiple muscle fibers from 4 to 700, but it's going to be the one motor neuron to all of the muscle fibers. So the smaller number it attaches to, the greater the fine control, the greater you're able to move really, really, really small movements. Ooh, wrong color. So this will be small movements. And with this motor unit, it's going to be spread throughout the entire muscle. So that way, if you've got a muscle that is this long, if this stimulation is going to connect here, he's going to actually have the branches to connect here, and there'll actually be a branch where it can connect here. So that way you actually don't just stimulate this area, but you stimulate this area of the motor neuron. So that's really, really important to get contraction of the whole muscle. So to zoom in on this motor unit right here, you can see here is a neuron coming down. Here it's neuromuscular junction. This is where it's connecting. And you can see how it's got all of these little branches. That is how we're connecting to all these different muscle fibers and multiple parts of the same muscle fiber. So that's how you can see you can get the whole thing to contract. So this whole thing is one muscle, but this red, or let's just this purple guy, he's connecting this muscle fiber and he's connecting this muscle fiber. So that way we're able to contract them at the same time. So that's really, really important. The next thing we're going to talk about is something called a muscle twitch. So this is a fun name. So a muscle twitch is when you're going to have the motor unit respond to a single action potential. So it will be the motor unit that will respond to a single action potential. And remember, an action potential, go back and review sections 9.3, I believe is where it is, if that is not familiar with this concept. So muscle twitch, it's a simplest contraction, which means it's one, resulting in the muscle fiber's response to a single action potential from a motor neuron. So it's going to react very quickly, and then it's going to react. So it's going to essentially just create a twitch, kind of like an eye twitch. It's a great way to example it. So you can actually record this on something called a myogram. So when you're looking at it, it's kind of like an EEG or an EKG where you see the bumps move based on this. So we're going to look at this. This is going to be our myogram. And so it's a muscle twitch. So if you look at this on the x-axis, it's going to be time. So we're actually going to look at how fast it works. And this is milliseconds. So when we say something happens in the blink of an eye, it's just a twitch. We're talking about it happening within 30 milliseconds. That's a very, very rapid time frame. So in this muscle twitch, there are 3 phases to the muscle twitch. And it happens really rapidly, but these 3 phases will always happen. There'll be the latent period, and the latent period is going to be where you are actually doing the excitation contraction coupling. You are starting to connect. So this is actin and myosin, to flash back to all the pieces of the first half of the chapter. In the latent period, this is where you're going to have cross-bridge cycling. Your excitation contraction has occurred, but you're starting your cross bridges. So you haven't started breaking them. You're starting to form your cross bridges. So your actin and your myosin are connecting, but they haven't pulled and they haven't slid yet. So therefore, there's no tension. No work is being attempted. The second period of a muscle twitch is going to be the contraction. This is going to be about 10 to 100 milliseconds into the duration of the muscle twitch. This is where you're going to have active cross bridges. So you're going to cycle through those. So you are doing the sliding filament of contraction over and over and over and over again. And as you're doing this, your tension will actually increase. So you're going to start creating that movement and that tension. And then what's happening here is that with this tension, as it's increasing, it's going to hit a point where it can't increase anymore, and then it's going to have to go through a period of relaxation. And the third step of relaxation is essentially where you're going to stop the cross bridge cycling and you're going to decrease your tension. So the way that process will work is it will start and it will be actually initiated by, trying to make sure we can see it, calcium re-entry. So this will actually start, your relaxation period will start when our calcium re-enters the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So in the T-tubules and the triad, where you're going to store calcium in the terminal cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If that rings a bell, go review the first half of the chapter. But this relaxation period will start when calcium leaves the inside of the muscle fiber and returns to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If we do not have calcium, we do not have skeletal muscle contraction. So that means that our cross bridge number will decrease. And the reason our cross bridges will decrease is because we no longer have the calcium moving the tropomyosin from our active binding sites. So actin and myosin cannot connect. So we're going to decrease our cross bridge numbers that are being formed. Therefore, our contracting force will decrease. If we don't have cross bridges, we don't have force of contraction, and our muscle tension will decrease. And this process will occur usually around 10 to 100 milliseconds after the contraction phase. So at this point we've gone, this is our muscle twitch. We've gone through the latent period of contraction, and then relaxation. So immediately you're going to be in this point of no cross bridges forming, and you're starting to connect, but you haven't actually created any tension yet. And then you're going to go through the period where you're doing cross bridge cycling. You're going to create more tension. So this is going to be an increase in tension up the graph. And then that will be around, after this stops, 10 to 100 milliseconds after the end of contraction or the beginning of contraction. Then it will be this relaxation phase where you'll get this decrease in tension because your calcium has returned to the SR. So this is your muscle twitch. This is also going to be something we're going to talk a lot about, this particular graph. So take some time and get used to it. It will usually, almost always, be time on the x-axis and tension on the y-axis. So as our muscles are actually going to be doing this, we're going to have some really cool features. So there's a difference in the strength and the duration of the tension due to a couple different things. One of them can be the metabolic properties. If there's a whole lot more hormones and cellular activity and normal homeostatic mechanisms in place, it'll go faster, as well as enzymes that are occurring between muscles. It'll go faster. So here's our muscle twitch. It can also differ based on the size of the muscle. So with these three examples here, these are three different sized muscles. So we have our gastrocnemius, which is going to be the in our leg. We're going to have soleus, which is going to be in our upper thigh. Then we're going to have our lateral rectus, which is a muscle in the eye. So it's a small, medium, kind of large setup. And you can see that the small one, this extraocular muscle, has a fast, very fast. It starts and it ends and it goes through all three of those phases here. Whereas this other muscle goes through all three of those phases in 200 milliseconds. So the length of your muscle twitch is determined based on your size of your muscle. And it's a really cool premise. So some of our other normal muscle contraction is going to be relatively smooth, and your strength will vary based on what you actually need to do. And this concept is going to be called a graded muscle response. So a graded muscle response. What this means, let's make this a little smaller so we can write. A graded muscle response is going to be that there are different strength of the contraction that is going to be needed for different demands. So you have the ability in your arms to be able to lift a wide range of loads. So you could lift all the way from a pencil, where you're just picking up a pencil off the table, to lifting 100 pounds of dog food into your grocery cart. Your muscles know whether or not they need to prepare for the 1 ounce that your pencil will actually be weighing, or the 100 pounds that the dog food will be weighing. So the strength of the contraction will be for different demands. And these responses are going to be graded by two things, and we're going to talk more about these. You can change the frequency of how many times you stimulate it, and you can change the strength of the stimulation. So this graded muscle response can change, and is going to be or controlled. And it will be controlled in these two ways. So we're going to talk about that. So the first one is we're going to change the muscle stimulus frequency. So if we change the frequency of stimulation, we are essentially telling it to go more times. So stimulation is going to be excitation. We've essentially given it a communication to do something. And if we change how many times that we do that, it's going to do that thing more. So your end up is your single stimulus results in a single contractile response. You're going to get a muscle twitch. So for example, if I increase the force by increasing, I'm going to do a lot of up and down arrows for increase and decrease. It's just a whole lot easier for notes. But you're going to increase the force by increasing the firing rate. And you're going to do this. Firing rate is going to be of your motor neurons. So when we look at this graded response to this thing, whenever you see this stimulus like this and it's in red, so I'm going to make mine actually this. Whenever I see you this is going to be the go. So it's the stimulation. It's how many times you tell it to go. So here we have told it to go twice. One right here, two right here. So you'll notice when that happens, you do see the normal change. Up and then relax. Go up and then relax. So you see that happen. You'll notice all the way up here in this muscle twitch, let's do this one, we only had one peak because we only had one stimulus right here. Where now when we come down, we have the two stimuluses, we have 1, 2, we get the 2 peaks. So this is going to be an individual twitch. This is going to be twitch 1, and this is twitch 2, and they're happening in isolation. But what happens when we change the stimulus frequency? So that's what we're talking about. We tell it to go a whole lot more. You will get something that is going to be called temporal summation. And temporal summation basically is saying that a second stimulus that happens, another go signal, will add to the effects of the first. So it's summative. And as it adds to the effects of the first, this will really only occur when they are delivered in rapid succession. So they have to be pretty close together in order to get this temporal summation. It doesn't work if you tell it to go and then 5 minutes later tell it to go. It needs to be go, 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 go. So these essentially, what you're doing is you're adding the contractions. That is how you can adjust the strength. So you're going to add these contractions. And it's a process that's called temporal or wave summation. And these are going to occur in rapid succession. And the way this works is there's not enough time for the muscle fibers to relax. So you essentially add. The way it does that is you're going to add more calcium. So this is actually going to be that process of sarcoplasmic reticulum, your T-tubules and your triad. You're going to add more calcium to what is already inside the muscle cell. So you'll notice here we have stimulation 1, and then we have our contraction, and it goes like this. But before it can relax, we have another contraction, another stimulus, which will make it go up. So we never came back to baseline. And then we go contract, we increase our tension, we come down, we have another thing telling us to go. And again, we have not come down to our normal yet. So there's still space. We have not hit our baseline. And these things can actually, this one can add to this one, add to this one, and add to this one. So you're summating the effects before it completely contracts. So when this is happening, you're going to cause additional lengthening. So this can keep going when the stimulating at a faster and faster and faster rate. So these little red lines can get a whole lot closer together. So when we're stimulating at a faster rate, there's a couple things that can happen. So if we keep getting faster, the muscle tension will hit maximum. At some point, your muscle tension will cap out. And when it does cap out, you are at maximum muscle tension. You can't contract anymore. You have That one muscle is at the most tension it will ever be able to produce in this moment. So it's going to cap out. So you can't go too far up the graph. However, you can still summate. And that's what's going to happen in this process called unfused or incomplete tetanus. Essentially, you are doing increased stimulus frequency. We are telling it to go a whole lot more. So if we are going to have something called incomplete or unfused tetanus, what this means we are doing is we are going to have sustained quivering contraction. Quivering means that we don't just stay, we will go through and kind of wave through, contract, a little bit of release, contract, a little bit release, contract, a little bit of release. So here is our unfused tetanus. So this is a great example. So it's going to be high stimulation frequency. So with this, we are increasing the temporal summation. You are increasing how much it adds over time. That's what that means. And you're going to get this. Here's our maximum tension, essentially right here. It can't go past this, but this is the quivering. It never fully relaxes, but it kind of has this quiver to it. And this is when you're working out really, really hard and your muscles are legit shaking. So then you can also do something if you're going to increase this muscle frequency and you're going to really keep increasing it. It can increase further than this. So if the stimulus frequency increases more, which means we're going to have more of these lovely little guys telling it to go, you're going to hit maximum even more. So that's going to lead to something called complete or fused tetanus. And this is going to be the most maximal contraction. So you're going to increase the muscle tension until it is at the absolute maximum it can go. And when it's at the maximum, it's going to be complete. And what it will do is it will create a smooth but sustained. So it'll stay there. A smooth and sustained contraction that will look like a plateau. And this plateau will have no muscle relaxation happening. So it's not going to do the quiver because with this fused and complete tetanus, the contractions have kind of fused into each other. So here we go. We have increased these guys. There's a whole lot more of them. We're going to do our muscle twitches and then they summate. We have this fused tetanus. So it is not this. That is not occurring. It is this. And when that happens, you are at maximum tension. This is not necessarily the best because if you keep at this level, you'll actually lead to muscle fatigue. So this is not really possible to stay at for a very, very long time. So there's also another term that you'll need to know when we're talking about these terms is they say incomplete and complete, but they're also called tetanus. So that's a really cool how science is kind of named for the same thing that will happen physiologically that's going on in your body. So if you've ever heard or the disease tetanus, this is very common and more common probably, I know it's super common in the South, but this is actually due to the bacteria that is called Clostridium tetani. And this bacteria will actually lead to consistent muscle contractions. So if you get this bacteria, your muscles will start to contract consistently. And what you do is you get this. So with tetanus, the biggest thing that they say to look out for is going to be lockjaw. And lockjaw, what kills you with tetanus, it is a deadly disease, but it kills you not because it shuts down any of your internal organs or it messes up too many homeostatic mechanisms. It actually will maintain this fused, complete tetanus, and it likes to target the muscles in your jaw. So your jaw will actually maintain its contracted, closed state. And if that not happens, you're not able to get food and water. So tetanus is actually deadly because you will essentially die of starvation. Modern day medicine, we have the ability to do IV nutrients and water. However, in the old times, tetanus was deadly because it led to this sustained contraction, but specifically it always targeted the jaw. So you got lockjaw, and then getting nutrients to the body was a problem. So that's a really cool way how the worlds kind of come together. So that was the first way you can increase the contraction, is you can tell it to go a whole lot more times. You can summate it. Now we're going to move on to the second way you can change a muscle response is by changing the strength of the stimulus. So not only have we changed, the first one was we changed how many times we told it to go, and then this one we're going to change a whisper to a yell. The communication, the stimulus is actually going to get stronger. So with the changing of the stimulus strength, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially recruit more things. So there's something called the recruitment. So if you send the stimulus to more than one muscle fiber, you're going to get a more precise control. So it's really, really cool when you think about the fact that we need to have different levels of control. So this is going to be achieved through a couple things with these three principles: subthreshold stimulus, threshold stimulus, and our maximum stimulus. So I'm going to drive down here and look at this graph a couple times so we can see what these three pieces are. So when we're looking at changing the strength of the stimulus, there are going to be three things that we're going to do. We're going to have our subthreshold stimulus, and our subthreshold stimulus is going to be a stimulus that does not produce a contraction. So it's essentially you telling your kids to put on their shoes in a whisper. It doesn't work. It's there, but the signal is so small that it essentially does not work. There's no contraction. You're whispering to your kids from the other room to tell them to put on their shoes. But then you can have a stimulus where it's the threshold stimulus. And the threshold stimulus is going to be the stimulus where you will actually see the first observable contraction. So you're able to see with the naked eye the first contraction that can happen. So you're starting to contract, and then you're going to hit something called a maximal stimulus. And the maximal stimulus is the strongest stimulus. And if you have the strongest stimulus, you will have maximal force. So using my example of telling your child to put on their shoes, a sub-threshold stimulus, you're whispering from the other room. It doesn't actually work. It doesn't produce a contraction. Threshold stimulus is you actually saying it the first time, and one of your kids understands and gets it and starts to actually do what you asked. There's movement. There's a contraction. Maximal stimulus would be yelling at the top of your lungs in order to have them put on their shoes, and then you're going to have all of the kids put on your shoes because that's the strongest stimulus you can give. When this maximal stimulus is happening, this is a really important premise. All motor units have been recruited. So if you whisper, you only get a little bit, whereas if you yell and you have the maximal, this will recruit all motor units. So remember, a motor unit is the one motor neuron in all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. So remember, the red arrow is the stimulus, but all of the others were the same height when we looked at all of these guys, because they're all the same strength. Whereas if we look at here, they get bigger because it's a stronger signal, a stronger stimulus. So you'll see how here we have our threshold. This is what we need to do to get our first contraction. This is below, this is below, this is at. So we're going to see the first contraction here. But then we're going to slowly, we're going to get louder and louder and louder until we're yelling. At some point, you can be yelling at the top of your lungs, but you will have capped out at the maximal stimulus. And it doesn't matter how much more you yell, you have done everything you can. So with this one contraction, right, with this one stimulus, how little it is, you'll look right here. None of our muscle fibers were pulled. So this right here is an example of, remember, a muscle fiber, I described it as a straw. They're very long and they're elongated. Well, if I have a straw and I put a bunch of straws together, like we do have in a muscle fiber, what these pictures are doing is they are actually doing a cross section through that, and you're looking at the ends. So all of these little dots are the ends of our muscle fibers. So you're actually looking at it head on. Okay, so with this, you'll notice that in this one, there's no muscle fibers. It's sub-threshold. Here, where we said you were actually getting your first contraction, you'll notice we have activated 2 of our muscle fibers. As we get louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, eventually we're going to hit all of our muscle fibers. So all of these guys right here have been recruited. You'll notice that this also is where we hit maximal. We can yell, yell, yell louder. We will not change anymore. We cannot recruit anyone else. So that's how it's going to happen when we hit our size principle of recruitment, meaning the larger the size of the stimulus, the more recruitment you will have, until at some point you actually cap out on your recruitment. So we can change our muscle contraction based on increasing the frequency of the stimulation or increasing the strength of the stimulation. So that is those 2 processes right there. So this is I guess I skipped ahead with our size principle. So one thing to keep in mind with this size principle, and this is the size principle of recruitment. So the muscle fibers that you recruit first, so the ones that we get here first, when you're recruiting these muscle fibers, the motor unit with the smallest fibers, so this is going to be a very skinny piece of hair, the motor unit with the smallest muscle fibers is activated first. So smallest goes first. And then as you go and you keep yelling, you're going to recruit more and more and more and more. So the motor units with the larger muscle fibers they are going to begin to be contracted, but the ones that are the largest will only be activated when necessary. So they're going to take a lot of stimulus to be able to be activated. So the way this actually is going to work is because the smallest is activated first. These are going to be highly excitable. It doesn't take a lot to get them excited. They're small, but they're mighty. Whereas our motor units that are larger, they will be done later. These are not excitable. So for these, they are the least excitable. It takes a lot to get a large muscle motor unit working. So these premises right here are very, very, very important. So you'll notice here's one little piece of communication. We get a small muscle, a medium muscle, a whole lot more muscles. We can actually increase our tension from here to here. Okay, so that's that whole premise. Now this is another concept going to be called muscle tone. So when we're looking at this idea here, this is a different concept. Switching gears, we've moved on to muscle tone. And muscle tone is going to be that even a relaxed muscle that you have, so you're just sitting in your chair, even a relaxed muscle is slightly contracted. So we are holding our bones in alignment. So your muscles are actually going across your joints and they're holding your skeleton in place, but they're also holding it in alignment. So even though you are not currently maybe moving your arm, the muscles of your arm are working to keep it in a slightly contracted place in order to keep your muscles in alignment. If you didn't have that, you would have very floppy, loose arms that does not have the ability to kind of maintain its anatomical structure of alignment. So muscle tone is really, really important, and it's going to be this constant, slightly contracted state. And this is going to be due to some spinal reflexes in your body that you have, and this is also controlled by the cerebellum. So it's actually really, really, really cool. And it's going to keep your muscles firm, healthy, and ready to do what they need to do. It's also, I would add to that, going to help maintain posture, and it will work to stabilize joints. Keep everything where they need to be. Okay, so now we're going to move back to the concepts of contractions. So here's two terms called tonic and isometric contractions. So this is really interesting. We're going to talk about isotonic first. So an isotonic contraction, first we're going to look at the name. Iso means same, tonic. So just keep that in mind. We're looking at isotonic contraction. This is going to be the same tension. That is what that means. Iso means same, like an isosceles triangle. They were all the same, all the angles and all the sides. Tonic is going to mean tension. So this is going to be that when the muscle length changes, so when you contract the muscle, the load will move. So with an isotonic contraction, here we go. Here's our muscle. He's attached here and he's attached here. If we increase it and contract it and contracts our muscle, you'll notice that this happens. We have moved the load. So now we're here and now we're here. This is the load that we're moving. So as the muscle length changes, i.e. it contracts, the load will actually move with the same tension. So this is going to be the tension will remain constant. There's two kinds of an isotonic contraction. You're going to have a concentric contraction. So a concentric contraction is going to be the muscle shorten. And if it does that, it will do work. So this is an example of exactly what I just described right here. The muscle shortens and then it's going to do work. But you can also have an eccentric contraction. And this is where you are contracting. Your muscle is going to be, you're not contracting. Your muscle is doing the opposite. Your muscle is lengthening. Because if you contract your muscle, you also need to be able to put it back in its original position, so it needs to lengthen. However, you're still doing work. You are still generating force. You're just not shortening. So one of them is shortening, one of them is lengthening. So when you pick up the book, you're contracting your muscles to shorten, but you're still moving the book. That's concentric. When you go to put it down, You are lengthening the muscles of your arm. You're still doing work. There's still force, but it's an eccentric contraction. So with these graphs, if they're super helpful, just to give you an idea, this is the one we've been looking at a lot where you've got tension, and this is going to be time on the y-axis. And then this one is doing muscle length. So as it goes this way, it is shortening. So the muscle length is actually decreasing. This is starting, this is ending. So the muscle is shortening. You increase the tension, you shorten the muscle. Okay, that's an isotonic. You're doing the same amount of tension, whether you're shortening or you're lengthening. But then there's another type that's not the isotonic. It's going to be the isometric. And this is a little bit different to think about. So an isometric contraction, what you are doing with this is it's called the same measure, if that is helpful. Metric, iso, same, metric, measure. This is the same measure. So what's happening with this is you are actually producing tension. You are getting the stimulus. You are producing tension in your muscle, but the muscle does not shorten. So if the muscle does not shorten, the load doesn't move. So an example of this is you trying to flip your car upside down. If you push on the side of your car, you are generating tension in all of your muscles, but you are not going to generate enough tension to flip the car. So you're still doing an isometric contraction. You're still contracting because you're producing tension, but the muscle has not moved, so the muscle stays the same length. That's what it means. So down here, let's highlight this so you know how to do it. So down here, this is the starting point. We've increased our tension, but we do not shorten the muscle. It stays the same length. Essentially, this usually occurs when the thing you're trying to move outweighs your maximum force. So that's what's going on with an isometric contraction. And these are the same principles of a skeletal muscle contraction. So it's the same principle, however, the results are different. So in an isotonic contraction, the thin filaments are sliding over the thick. You are getting essentially that cross-bridge cycling premise. However, when you have the isometric, you're going to have the cross-bridge form. Your actin and your myosin will connect. You will have tension, but there will be no filament movement. So you connect, you just don't slide. So that's what's happening with this. With an isometric, when you're going to generate the force, but you're not actually going to shorten, your myosin wheels essentially just spin their heads, and they just don't. They keep trying to connect, but they just connect on the same spot on actin. So here's another example of if we increase our tension, doesn't matter. We have no change in our actual length. This is an isometric contraction. Okay, so this next section, 9.6, is all going to be about energy and how we actually get energy out of our skeletal muscle. How do we produce the energy needed for our skeletal muscle contraction? So 9.6, we're going to talk about 3 premises of processes and reactions that happen in our body. So energy, we need ATP. We already talked about it one place, but we're going to need ATP because here is how we use our ATP. We need ATP to move and detach are cross bridges. We know we need this because if we don't have ATP, we don't have cross bridge cycling. We also need ATP to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Then we also need ATP to do our sodium and our potassium pump. So that whole part of chapter 2 or 3 where we talked about the sodium potassium pump and 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium in, this is a cell. Muscle fiber is a cell, so that is still happening in the background. We need ATP for that process. So that's really, 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 really important for these 3 things. So how do we get ATP? We store it, but we use it really, really quick. So when we do our when we use our ATP, we're able to produce our own, but we use it very, very fast. So therefore, we need to come up with some sort of regeneration where we can make ATP quickly because we use it so much. So ATP is going to be regenerated. So we can make more of it by 3 different ways. The first way is going to be a process called direct phosphorylation. It's an easy process to know. Second process is going to be the anaerobic pathway. And if we have the anaerobic pathway, we're also going to have an aerobic pathway. So these are the 3 ways. A big takeaway from the second half of this chapter is knowing these 3 processes and how you regenerate ATP. So these are the 3 things: direct phosphorylation, an anaerobic pathway, and an aerobic pathway. So we're going to talk about these 3. So we're going to start, and this is high priority to know. So we're going to start with the first one, direct phosphorylation. So with direct phosphorylation, what we are doing is we are going to create ATP from creatinine phosphate. So it's a molecule that you have in your body naturally, creatinine phosphate, that we can essentially create ATP from. So the biological mechanism, we're going to take our creatinine phosphate, and what happens in the body is you're going to add that to ADP, because that's a diphosphate, and guess what? Here's our phosphate, here's our phosphate. This will actually create creatinine as a byproduct plus ATP. So we will get this right here. With this process, it's a high energy molecule. It's great. We can actually use this. And our muscle cells do actually store creatinine phosphate, so it's relatively easy to actually use. This is very efficient. It's a good process to have. However, it's not going to be the most efficient because with our ATP and stored creatinine phosphate, so when we have our ATP, once we go through and use our ATP that we have immediately, and then we use our creatinine phosphate stores, when all of this is used up, this process will actually take about 15 seconds. So all that means is that we have enough stored in our muscles for 15 seconds of energy. So it's very efficient. It's fast. It only requires 2 things. But this right here, we don't store a lot of, and we'll use everything up in 15 seconds, which means you can climb a flight of stairs. You can't run a marathon. So we still have to be able to produce other mechanisms to create ATP. So this is a really good process, but this is going to be one of the cons. So for each of these processes, there's pros and then there's cons, and I would include those and make a list. So there's some pros for this, but a con is that it will actually run out after 15 seconds. So here's the direct phosphorylation that you can see. We have ADP, here's our reactants. We're adding that to our creatinine phosphate plus our ADP, and we're going to get our creatinine plus 1 ATP. So this process will create 1 ATP. That is important. Okay, so then what happens do we do after 15 seconds is up? Then we're going to go either the aerobic or the anaerobic pathway. So we need to create more ATP. If we are in this process of, first we go through our stored ATP, there's not a lot of it, and then we go through and we produce more ATP, that's what we need to do. There's 2 ways we're going to do it. First, you're going to do direct phosphorylation. That's the process we just talked about. That only lasts for 15 seconds. And then you're going to go through these next 2 processes. And the way you're going to do it is you're going to use stored glucose or stored glycogen. So we're going to go through this process, but this is where we branch, and we will do either anaerobic or we will do aerobic. So we need to get more ATP. We first go through our stored, then we make more through direct, and then we actually switch to our stored glucose. This is how you use up your energy. When you're doing an anaerobic pathway, this is going to be without the presence of oxygen. Your anaerobic pathway is going to be without, I left that out, oxygen, whereas your aerobic pathway is going to be with oxygen. So we've already done this one. Now we've got anaerobic and aerobic to do, and that's what this guy is. So looking at part 2, or second process, this is our anaerobic pathway. So we are producing ATP, and this is going to be from glycolysis because we're using glucose, but it is going to be without oxygen. So it does not require oxygen. So how this process will actually work is we are going to take glucose and it will go through a process where it will get converted into pyruvic acid. This pyruvic acid, when this happens, we are actually going to gain 2 ATP. So remember up here I said you only gained 1 in our direct phosphorylation. So down here in anaerobic, you're going to gain 2 ATP. The problem is your body doesn't stay at pyruvic acid. This guy continues, and you're going to get lactic acid. So pyruvic acid will be converted into lactic acid. So it will happen automatically. You can't really stop this process. So in order to get 2 ATP, we will get lactic acid as well. So this is awesome for these 2 ATP. However, what we're going to get with this is then you will get the buildup of our lactic acid. So in the absence of oxygen, your pyruvic acid will be converted to lactic acid, and that will actually build up. So in this lactic acid, what it will do is it'll diffuse into the bloodstream. You'll use it for fuel. It can convert it back to pyruvic acid or glycolysis. It's awesome, but it will actually build up. So look at this information. I skipped over a couple things, so I want to go back and look at them. Aerobic does use glucose, so make sure you guys pick up on that. And when this is happening with this anaerobic pathway and we're converting lactic acid, it will happen with maximal contraction, you're going to get bulging muscles. So think about when you would use anaerobic pathway when you don't have oxygen. This is going to be more of a weightlifter who is lifting up large weights in the gym. Their muscles are contracting. When you contract a muscle, it will actually inhibit the flow of blood through the arteries and veins that lie in that muscle. So anaerobic isn't just meaning you're not breathing. It means that the contraction of your muscle is actually stopping your oxygen from being delivered through your blood vessels, but you're still using those muscles. So that's kind of like this anaerobic pathway part. So you're going to have these large bulging muscles, which are going to impair the oxygen delivery. So this is a good process. It's fast. It's great. You're going to have, when oxygen is deficient, you can still make ATP, which is great. So that's awesome. A couple things about this process, though. It only yields 5% as much ATP as aerobic. So this next process we're going to talk about produces 95% more ATP. I wrote that really messy, so we're going to rewrite that. So your anaerobic will only produce 5% of ATP compared to the aerobic. So that's good. We can get ATP. We can get 2 ATP. However, it only makes 5% of what we could be making with the other pathway. However, a pro of this guy, so that's a con. A pro of this guy is going to be that it is 2.5 times faster than aerobic. So this is the fastest pathway because we go from glucose, byproduct is ATP. It's only one step. It's not very complicated. So these are all really good and awesome things with this aerobic pathway. Here's an example where you can see we start with glucose and we are going to go to pyruvic acid, and then pyruvic acid will go to lactic acid, and then what we're going to get is this right here. We're at 2 ATP. So that's the process just sideways. So now what happens if we use the process of aerobic respiration? So this is the third. So we're still going to use glucose because that's the branch that we're in. So it will start with that, and it will actually produce 95% of ATP during our normal everyday exercise. So it does this because it does require O2. And this is 95% of our ATP is formed this way. So this does include glucose, but it will actually break down every part of glucose to its final products, meaning that it has a lot of steps to the chemical reaction, which means it is going to be slow. So this is not the fastest one. It is going to be slower than, because it will go through a series of chemical reactions. So the equation for this is you're going to start with glucose. You're going to use oxygen for this one. That's a requirement. And it will go through a bunch of steps. If you've ever done the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, it falls into that category where it's multiple steps. You're going to end up with CO2 plus H2O plus ATP. So that's great that you'll actually end up with this ATP. However, you're not just going to get 1 ATP. You are going to get 32 ATP. So this is where you make 95%, is because this one makes 32 ATP, where this one only made 2 ATP. So that's what's happening here. So this will actually usually kick in for longer sustained durations of exercise. So if you look at this pathway right here, you can see how we go from glucose to our pyruvic acid. Or we can do our aerobic respiration, and we're going to get 32 ATP, our water, our carbon dioxide, and then some other fatty acids and amino acids. So this is really important for all of these. So while this is great because it gives us a high yield of ATP, 32, a con for this, it is actually slow. And this does not only require oxygen, but it requires constant oxygen. So it has to be constantly connected to oxygen for this process to work. Okay, so you've heard about aerobic and anaerobic exercise. So just kind of how that works during sports. Aerobic endurance. So aerobic endurance is going to be the length of time that the muscle can contract while we're doing an aerobic activity. So basically, this is light to moderate activity. You're increasing your demand. You're doing normal everyday activities. You can kind of keep going. However, you can also have an anaerobic threshold where you're going to essentially convert from your normal metabolism to the anaerobic pathway. So this is where you're going to keep going for long, sustained kind of duration. You won't be able to do that with this aerobic exercise. With anaerobic, you essentially hit the threshold because you will need oxygen. So it all comes back to the oxygen for that. So you can see how the anaerobic pathway you can only do for a short duration of time, whereas the aerobic pathway you can keep going for quite a bit. However, you will hit a state where your muscles will actually go through a process of fatigue. Doesn't matter how in shape or how awesome you are, your muscles will actually hit a threshold. So there is going to be a point with muscle fatigue where the muscles will actually physiologically be unable to contract. It doesn't matter how many times you tell it to go. And this is going to be even with stimuli. It does not matter. You can tell it to go. You can tell it to contract. It literally is not able to do this. We don't really know why muscle fatigue happens. We just know that it does. It might be due to imbalances with ions or phosphate needing to be accumulated, not accumulated, too much lactic acid. We're still trying to figure that out. We just know that there is a point where your muscles are not able to continue contracting. They're not able to continue doing force. We're still trying to figure that out. There's also then a concept called EPOC, which stands for excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. EPOC. And so this is going to be a premise of, in order to return to a pre-exercise state, to go back to normal, in order to return to a pre-exercise state, the muscles must do a couple things. So they must replenish oxygen. They have to be able to do that. They must also reconvert lactic acid that has built up through the anaerobic cycle back to pyruvic acid. And both aerobic and anaerobic use glycogen, so they must replace your glycogen stores. This is why they actually tell you to drink milk after a run, is to help do this process. And then whatever ATP and your creatinine phosphate that you used must be resynthesized. So essentially you need to go back to your baseline And you do that through this excess post-oxygen consumption. So you essentially, this is why you have that wheeze or that rapid breathing after exercise, because it is something where you're taking in more oxygen because you're trying to do all of these things that just need to happen so then you can move about and continue on. Okay, that's the end of PowerPoint B. We're going to just quickly move on to PowerPoint C. So with PowerPoint C, we're starting with 9.7, 9.8, and 9.9. The focus is going to be mainly 9.7 and 9.8 for this exercise. So looking at, with our muscle contraction, we have talked a lot about all of these pieces. But with our muscle contraction, we still have to talk about the force. We have to talk about the contraction itself. So when we're doing our force of our muscle contraction, it will depend on the number of cross bridges attached, which is affected by 4 things. So the strength of the actual force of the contraction. So this is going to be 4 things that will actually affect the force of the contraction. It's a summary, basically, of what we've already talked about. First one is the number of muscle fibers recruited. So the more you have, the greater the force. Cool. The relative size of the fibers. The bigger the muscle, the larger the muscle fibers, the more tension it can develop. The smaller the muscle, not as much tension. That's kind of a common sense thought right there. And then the last 2, again, this is kind of a summary. The last 2, so the third thing that can affect the force of your contraction is going to be the size of the amount of stimulation. So the frequency of your stimulation. How many times you tell it to say go. You do it more often, the higher the frequency, the greater the force. And then you can also do it by the degree of muscle stretch. So when we're talking about the degree of muscle stretch, what we're saying with this is how much it can contract and how much then it can relax back to its normal resting length. So with the degree of muscle stretch, muscles that are going to have a sarcomere that is wide, 80 to 120% of their normal resting length, will generate more force. Whereas if their sarcomere is shorter, there's not a whole lot of room to shorten the H zone and pull the actin and myosin closer together and pull that Z line closer together, so you're not going to have as much. So that's where that degree of muscle stretch, this is where the sarcomere structure comes back into play, because based on the sarcomere, if we have our Z line here and here, remember this is our sarcomere, we can essentially only shorten the length where our actin is meeting in the middle. We can only shorten this much. But if we have our Z lines this far apart, and it's the same premise, but they're attached like this, we can shorten this much. So that's what that means by the degree of muscle stretch. So looking at these right here. Okay, so there's also another thing that will affect your contraction, and that is going to be how fast and how long it stays contracted. So these are going to be 2 concepts called velocity plus duration. So this is how fast the muscle contracts, velocity, and then it's going to be how long it stays contracted. It's duration. These are going to be influenced by three things: the fiber type, the load, and then the recruitment. So fiber type is going to be the biggest one that will affect velocity and duration. So muscle fiber type. Muscle fiber, remember, is the muscle cell. So what we're talking about with this is there are two ways you can classify a muscle fiber. So when we're talking about a muscle fiber type, we're essentially going to classify it first. So you can classify a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. The first way is going to be the speed of the contraction. The faster you are able to contract versus the slower you are able to contract. So we're going to have slow fibers and we're going to have fast fibers. So you can contract things slow or you can contract things fast. Another classification we're going to have is going to be how it forms ATP. So this is going to be the pieces that we just talked about. It will either form ATP through oxidative mechanisms. So these will be oxidative fibers. And if it's in oxidative fibers, it is oxygen, which means it is aerobic. Or you can produce ATP through something called a glycolytic fiber. And a glycolytic fiber is going to be without oxygen. So it is going to be the anaerobic pathway. So we can name our muscle fibers based on their speed and based on how they make ATP. So it can be a slow or a fast, or it can be oxidative or glycolytic. So this is a important thing to know with these. So with our muscle fiber types and these two criteria, it is classified into three different categories. And you'll notice here's our velocity, slow, fast, fast. Here's our ATP creation. So these are the three we're going to have. All of your muscle fibers are split into these three categories. And they will determine the velocity and duration of your fibers. So we're going to go through these one by one kind of quickly. We have slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. So our three types. We are going to have slow oxidative. And when you have slow oxidative, this is going to be for endurance type activities. So these are going to contract slow because it's in the name, slow oxidative. And it does require oxygen for this pathway to continue. So this is going to be great, this slow oxidative, for low intensity endurance. Going on a very long walk, maintaining your, or I guess fast oxidative would be the medium intensity, depending on how hard you're walking. So this is going to be just standing, walking up and down stairs, being able to sit up in your chair and maintain your core. Slow oxidative is like normal everyday life. And then you can have fast oxidative. Fast oxidative is going on a walk. This is medium intensity. So for these guys, it's going to contract a little rapidly due to fast myosin. So this is going to be short-term, rapid movements. This uses little to no oxygen because it's glycolytic, but it does depend on your glycogen stores. So this is fatigable. You will actually have a decent amount of fatigue with this one, which is why with sprinting, you can feel that. And then you have the third type, which is fast glycolytic. So these three are to not be confused, even though the names are super familiar. With fast glycolytic, this is going to be I apologize. My notes actually have these flipped and I did not catch that. So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to delete the short-term rapid movements from fast oxidative. So I just want to make sure you guys catch that. My notes actually did fast and oxidative and glycolic in the wrong order. So fast oxidative, just to hit that one more time, this is going to be our medium intensity. And this is an intermediate type. It is between the two. You're doing activities, but you're not pushing too hard and you're not just doing normal every day. Whereas your fast glycolytic are going to be your short-term, rapid, intense movements. So I do apologize for that. So an example that they give for this is hitting a baseball. This is where you've got to keep going on your ability to have fast, controlled, rapid movements that create a lot of force but are not sustained long term. So that is where these three will come into play for the three different types of aerobics you're going to do. Here's a great description that kind of talks about what's going on to compare the three to kind of see the difference with that. So when we're looking at this last section is going to be exercise, because skeletal muscle and exercise are really important. Oh, I skipped load and recruitment. So up here when we were talking about velocity and duration, how fast a muscle contracts and how long it stays contracted is based on these three things. So all of this has been muscle fiber type. The last 2 and 3 were going to be load and recruitment. So what these mean with load and recruitment, essentially the muscles contract faster with no load. So if you're not carrying the refrigerator up the stairs, you'll move up the stairs quicker. Your muscles will actually contract the faster they are without a load. The greater the load, once you add the refrigerator, you're only going to be able to have your contraction happen for a short amount of time. And if you add the refrigerator, you increase the load, you'll slow down the contraction. So that's the load. How big the load is will determine your length of contraction and the strength of contraction. And then the recruitment will actually be talking about size principle a little bit as an overview. The more motor units you have, the more you will maintain the contraction and the more you will be able to produce a greater force. So the faster and the more prolonged. So load and recruitment does factor into that. Okay, so now we're going to briefly talk through our exercise and the skeletal muscle, because that is how it all kind of fits together. So with our skeletal muscle and exercise, our exercise gains are based on the whole overload principle. So when you increase the work, so our exercise is based on the overload principle. If you increase the work, then you increase the strength that you're actually going to have. You increase the endurance so you can keep going, and then you must continue to increase work in order to see these goals. So this is like that overload principle. You add more weights, you get larger muscles, you can lift more. You add more weights, you get larger muscles, you can lift more. So it's that circular premise. However, when you do aerobic exercise, it doesn't necessarily work that way. This is actually where you're going to have changes in the skeletal muscle fiber itself. So when you have aerobic or endurance exercise, you will actually change the skeletal muscle itself. So this is going to be just jogging, swimming, taking a class at the gym, cycling, all of those pieces. What you will actually affect and change is you will increase the number of capillaries because you need more blood. You're going to increase the number of mitochondria because you're going to need to be able to synthesize that foundational ATP. And then you're going to need to create myoglobin, which is found in your blood. So aerobic exercise will actually change your skeletal muscle these 3 ways. If it changes this, you get greater endurance, strength, and resistance to fatigue. What's also interesting is that it may convert your fiber type. So regular endurance may convert fast glycolytic to fast oxidative. So this will actually convert your muscle fiber types. So it'll convert from fast glycolytic and it'll recruit these guys to fast oxidative. Meaning it didn't use oxygen and now we need to use oxygen because we have it, because it's aerobic. But then you can also do exercise that is resistance exercise. And resistance exercise is lifting weights, isometric, doing the any kind of machine or load that you're manipulating, not just using your body weight. Resistance exercise is going to kind of fall into that category. It's also going to be usually anaerobic, and your muscles will hypertrophy, so they will get much, much, much bigger. So these guys are actually going to increase your muscle size, not necessarily for these reasons, but what it will actually do, it'll increase your muscle size, and it will increase your mitochondria, your myofilaments, your glycogen, your connective tissue. It'll increase everything, and it'll increase it so much that this can be a challenge. But what it will also do is it will also convert fibers. And so whereas aerobic exercise will convert fast glycolytic, this one will convert fast oxidative to fast glycolytic. So it's the opposite. So this is that premise of different workouts can produce different results because different fibers are being utilized and then converted. So muscles do need to be active to remain healthy. And this is really, really, really big in the world of rehabilitation, is because if you go through the process of inactivity, paralyzed muscles will atrophy. You'll actually replace muscle tissue with connective tissue, and it's impossible to do any kind of rehabilitation from that point. So even those individuals who are bedridden or are in the areas of the hospital where they are not necessarily mobile themselves, there are usually going to be some sort of probably PT-based intervention that will come and do input activities to get those muscles working in order to not have them atrophy. So it's a big, big area of clinical work. So everything we talked about, 9.1 to 9.8, was skeletal muscle. This last section is switching gears completely and focusing on smooth muscle. So pretty much nothing from 9.1 to 9.8 applies. So it's a totally different chapter, a totally different section, almost a different chapter. For this, do not focus too heavily on this, but just kind of know the basic outline of what is going on with our smooth muscle. But the goal of this chapter is 9.1 to 9.8. For smooth muscle, what you really just need to focus on is that where it is found in the walls of the hollow organs, such as anything respiratory or your digestive, urinary, reproductive, circulatory, You will find it essentially anywhere you're going to have a tube, but it's not found in the actual heart. That will be your cardiac muscle, not your smooth. So that is one caveat to all of the hollow tubes. And this is going to be a little bit different with how it's actually organized. So this smooth muscle is into sheets of tightly packed fibers. So these muscle fibers are going to look a little bit different. So I'm going to skip down to the differences. So skeletal muscle versus smooth muscle. What makes them different from the microscopic perspective, how they are actually different? Smooth muscle will have spindle-shaped fibers. So the spindle-shaped means it'll look like this. They will be spindle-shaped fibers. They're going to be thin and short, whereas a muscle fiber would be long and wide. And there's only going to be one nucleus. So they are not multi-nucleated, and there is no striations. And then another feature is that it will only have endomysium. Endomysium, both pronunciations work. It does not have epi, and it does not have peri. So this is how skeletal muscle will differ from smooth muscle is these. And then it will also have something called varicosities or bulbous swellings instead of a neuromuscular junction. So to kind of show you what that looks like down here, this is your smooth muscle. So you can see how this is one of my muscle fibers, Inside it is my one nucleus. And here is my nerve fiber, but rather than being a neuromuscular junction, it kind of just creates these essentially bulbs that look like this, that then thread and attach to different areas. So that's what's going on with these varicosities in the smooth muscle. Another difference between our smooth muscle and our skeletal muscle is that, so we're just going to keep adding to this list right here. Our smooth muscle is going to have no T-tubules and a less elaborate SR. So it's not going to have the crazy triad that a skeletal muscle will have. It does have a sarcoplasmic reticulum and it does store calcium, but calcium is going to be used slightly differently. So up here, another difference is going to be that there's no T-tubules, therefore no triad. And the calcium will actually enter the cell from the extracellular space. So rather than coming from the terminal cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum it'll enter from the extracellular space. So that's another difference between smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, is where calcium comes from. Okay, it's not letting me zoom down. There we go. So they will come from extracellular places. So you can see this is your plasma membrane. Rather than having your T-tubule, it's got this other thing called a calveoli that will come and bend down, but the general premise will actually still apply. Another big difference is going to be that smooth muscle are going to be connected via gap junctions, where skeletal muscles were not kind of connected that way. There was no connection between them. And we've already said that there's no striations and no sarcomeres, but they do contain thick and thin filaments. So they do contain thick and thin. They're just not in the same pattern and organized the same way to create a sarcomere. So this they do have, but the difference is that they are connected to each other via gap junctions. and there are no sarcomeres in smooth muscle. So there's quite a bit of difference in the smooth muscle to skeletal muscle difference. Okay, so to focus on, here's some differences with the actual filaments themselves. The thick filaments are fewer, and the myosin heads are along the entire length. So that's one thing that's different with the filaments. And there's no troponin. So essentially it has tropomyosin, but it does not have troponin that will hold the tropomyosin in place. So the filaments are going to be slightly different as well. The filaments are also going to be arranged diagonally, just kind of a quick overview on this. So rather than in the very organized linear manner, they're going to be kind of on the diagonal. And it gives it kind of a corkscrew-like appearance. So this is essentially a contracted smooth muscle. So it kind of looks like to me a net with or a fish net where you've got the muscle inside, and that's kind of what it looks like when it contracts. So reminder of the comparison between skeletal, smooth, and contraction, cardiac. This is a great review to kind of see those three. Here is another great review. And these are great to be able to compare. If it comes down to cardiac, we haven't really talked about that. And then when it comes to the contraction of smooth muscle, I will not be focusing on how your skeletal muscle contracts. When you get to these areas in AMP2, talking about smooth muscle in relation to the specific system you're talking about, respiratory, digestive, urinary, any of those, this will kind of come into play on that. So we're not going to cover any of these pieces, and that is going to be it for the end of chapter 9. It is a heavy chapter, and the concepts do build onto what is covered in the first 9.1 to 9.4. However, this chapter itself covers such a wide variety of topics. This is why it's the heaviest, most difficult chapter that we will be covering this semester.